Hey guys, it's Stan here with another video. In this one, I want to talk about CPU selection and the potential impact it may have in games such as MMOs, for example, World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy. I've got a couple systems that are very similar with two different CPUs and a couple scenes of games from Final Fantasy and World of Warcraft that I want to talk about, deep dive into, and show you guys the performance difference just changing out a CPU will do. So I'll bring you a little closer and let's get into it. The system that you're looking at right now is my main workstation computer. So it's got a Threadripper CPU, but more importantly, it's got a Zen 2 based CPU. So a 3960X 24-core processor. The core count isn't all that important. What's important is the boost clock and the core architecture. So Zen 2, and generally since it's water cooled, I can boost anywhere from 4.3 to 4.4 gigahertz during gaming. So it's kind of representative of maybe lower core count CPUs in the Zen 2 family, so 3950X or lower core counts. The GPU is a 3090 FTW3 Ultra, also water cooled, so that thing is boosting to extreme levels and it's as good of a GPU as you can get. The last part is the monitor, which is a 3840 by 1600 resolution monitor, ultra wide. This pixel density or pixel resolution is somewhere in between a 27-inch 1440p monitor and maybe a 4K monitor, so like right in between in the terms of the number of pixels you're driving. With all that said here, you can see here, this is a game, Final Fantasy XIV. And if I bring you a little bit closer here, you can see the stats and the numbers, what you're looking at. And right at the top, the GPU is boosting to 2100 megahertz with a 95+% utilization, so fully utilized, meaning no bottleneck. The scene that is being rendered is generally a low population open world scene, and the most important part here is the CPU utilization. And you can see here 24 cores, 48 threads, but you got 2 threads loaded up, so that's a single core of almost full utilization, and then 2 more threads, which is another core utilization, and then most of a third core being utilized. So this game, even though it's nearly over actually 10 years old now, is able to load up a 3090 and still pull 120 frames per second. So this is kind of the best case scenario where you don't have a CPU bottleneck. Now, in the next scene I'm going to show you is a scene with a lot of people, a very populated area that you may run into such a CPU bottleneck. All right, this is a main city. You can see all the people running around here. And in this situation, exact same setup, but you can see the GPU's boosting a little bit higher because it's got a lot less load on it, 2145 megahertz with only 48% utilization. So less than half of the GPU is being utilized. Power consumption is down by quite a bit because you're only pulling about 270 to 280 watts. And you can see CPU wise, it is well, visually you really can't tell, but the number of threads is still the same being utilized, but you are maxing out the capabilities of the CPU. And if you look at the CPU core count, or not core count, but the CPU speed here, the actual individual cores, 4.16 or 4,316, so 4.3 gigahertz across the board. 4.3 gigahertz on Zen 2 is very respectable on a Threadripper system, but it's actually not too out of the ordinary for a Zen 2 processor. Maybe 8-core, 12-core processor might be able to boost up to maybe 4.4, 4.5 on the top end, but Zen 2 really just doesn't clock as high. So, takeaways is that in this situation, you can see Most importantly, the frame rate, you're dropped down to 53 FPS. In the previous scene, I forgot to mention, and you could probably rewind if you want to, but I was doing anywhere from 120 to 130 frames per second. Now, only 43% utilization on the GPU, only 55 frames per second. This is clearly a CPU bottleneck. And even in Final Fantasy XIV, which is a relatively old game, you're still able to fully utilize a 3090 on a Zen 2 based processor, but there's also times when you really are CPU bottlenecked. And what we'll see is when we swap over to the other system here, which I've got, this is also a 3090. This time it's a Founders Edition, also water cooled. And more importantly, it's got a 5950X CPU water cooled. So we can take a look at the numbers that we get in Final Fantasy. I've got the same scene set up here on this system now, and you can see here the GPU is running at 1950, so it's about 100 megahertz lower in boost just because it's a Founders Edition. But again, you can see I'm actually pulling 142 frames per second. I think on the Threadripper system, I was pulling right around 125, so about 20 more frames, give or take. Utilization 97% as expected. Power draw 380 to 390 watts. Again, because it's that Founders Edition. But what's more important is that the processor is running at 4.7 or 4.65 gigahertz. So Zen 3 5950X single core, or not single core, but one or two cores boosting up to 4.6, 4.7 gigahertz. You can see here, one core, two threads, one core, two threads, one core, and then half of a third core being used. Exact same scenario, just this time you get about 20 more frames, even in a fully CPU or fully GPU utilized scene like this one. Next, to go to somewhere a little bit more populated, again with more people here, let me bring you in again. And we can see this is where the real difference is, because you can see that the core boosts up to 2.4 gigahertz, 2040 The core boosts up to 2040 megahertz, and it's voltage limited. So again, you're not using the GPU all 100% utilization, but it's much higher with 70% utilization. This 70% utilization is primarily because the CPU is being a lot more utilized, and this ends up giving you 105 frames per second. If you recall, on the Zen 2 system, we were doing somewhere around 50 to 55 frames per second. This is doing almost double the number of frame rates. Virtually the same GPU, just a generational difference between Zen 2 versus Zen 3. And realistically, 4.7 gigahertz, yeah, it's about 200 more megahertz on the CPU clock, but just the way that you get the IPC difference and the way that it bottlenecks, Zen 2 bottlenecks in this game with a lot of people, it just makes all the difference in the world. On the next game here, we're back on the Threadripper system. We are currently in one of the lower population areas. This is the Night Fae tree of whatever area. And there's a couple people running around, but really it's not that highly populated. And if I bring you a little closer to what to expect here, you can see that the processor or the GPU is running at 4.15 megahertz, and it's got a 72% utilization with a power pull of 330 watts. Again, more importantly is what's going on the CPU side. You can see that the one WoW is a lot more single-threaded compared to Final Fantasy XIV, and a single thread here is being maxed out, and the remainder of that core, right? That's a core that's completely maxed out, and then I've got another core that's kind of bouncing around, maybe 40% utilization, 50%, and then we've got a few other small cores or small utilizations on cores. So the problem is this right here is a bottleneck. And the result of this bottleneck is that, again, 47% utilization and only pulling 81 FPS. Depending on where you are, the more people you have, the utilization goes down even more, and this bottleneck becomes even more apparent. But in a low population area, this is kind of what you can expect. Now again, if we swap over to the Zen 3 processor, we can see that the performance is much better. This time you get full utilization and you're pulling about 113, 112 frames per second. And this is primarily because of, again, the CPU is properly feeding the GPU. So this time you're actually GPU bound in this exact same scene, where you can see here we've got a single or two threads, single core being maxed out, two threads being single core being maxed out, and then maybe a third and a fourth core being half utilized. Where the major difference is if I can get you guys a little closer, the core speed is about 4.75 megahertz on the select cores that are being used. Yeah, it's true that it's only 300 more megahertz than the 3960X. Remember, 4.4 versus 4.7, 300 megahertz. That's not the main difference. The main difference is really the architecture between Zen 2 and Zen 3. So again, you can see the difference in performance just based on the CPU. All right, let's try to summarize basically what we just saw. Both systems, 3090, clocked relatively similarly. Two CPUs clocked between 4.4 versus 4.6 or 4.7, about a 300 megahertz difference. Generational difference though, one is Zen 2, one is Zen 3. And what you saw was that the CPU bottleneck on the Zen 2 system was so much more extreme compared to the Zen 3 system. It just shows you that even though these MMOs, Final Fantasy being 10 years old, World of Warcraft 15 plus years old, these games, MMOs, even on a very high resolution monitor, 3840 by 1600 monitor, generally you would imagine that at such a high resolution, these GPUs wouldn't have an issue with being CPU bound, but you can see that you can easily get CPU bound, and in some extreme scenarios, you get frame rates cut down in half, 100 frames down to 50 frames with a lot of populated areas, just because you have a slower CPU. So the takeaway is that if you're upgrading your GPU, common knowledge is that most of the time for high resolution monitors, 1440p or higher, you're always GPU bound, CPU is not a consideration. You might actually want to think again when you're playing these kind of MMOs where CPU limitations sometimes come into effect. So rule of thumb is if you are looking for CPU, a 10900K, 11900K, those are great CPUs. A 5800X, 5900X, and even 5950X are good for the high IPC and high boost clocks. You can see here, you hear 5950X, 16 cores is no good for gaming, but clearly I'm still getting 4.7 gigahertz on 4.75 gigahertz on just PBO alone. That you can see that it does boost even in gaming scenarios. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight into potential bottlenecks even on older games, CPU bottlenecks on older games. If this was useful for you guys, make sure to hit that like button, and in the comments down below, tell me what kind of CPU are you guys running with or you're worried about. Perhaps we can have a discussion down below. And if you want to see more tech videos like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like button on your way out as well. Anyway, my name is Stan, and I'll see you guys in the next one.